we are thrilled to present two of the world's brightest literary stars in conversation, Richard Flanagan and Jane Hirshfield, two of my very favorite writers, in celebration of Richard's newest novel, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams. It is a gorgeous book, both in its physical form. Look inside, you can see this beautiful cover, and in the writing inside, of course. And that very beauty became, for me, a kind of hope to hang on to as we delve into the tough subjects that the book explores. In the following excerpts from her rave review, the great writer Joy Williams described the world that this novel finds itself in. Quote, "This is 2020, annus horribilis. COVID is not the subject. Instead, it is the fires, the collapsing ecosystems, the billions of animals dead. This is what is happening, this huge, crude wiping away of the world. But mostly it is not commented upon. If we can still text and tap and share and send and move around our monies, we'll be all right. Scroll on." Williams goes on to state that, quote, "The novel, the most sociable of arts, must no longer tread the same familiar, arid, anthropocentric paths, and that, quote, any novelist writing at this moment should write in such a way that no reader can remain indifferent or feign ignorance or innocence of our role in the subjugation of the world." Richard Flanagan has done just that, but he's always been a brave writer. He won the Booker Prize in 2014 for his incredibly powerful novel. I have like all of them. The Narrow Road to the Deep North, based on his father's experience as a Japanese POW in World War II. Several earlier novels included the quirky Gold's Book of Fish. Before that, very deeply emotional, The Sound of One Hand Clapping, both bestsellers. But rather than just rest on those laurels and kind of repeat a proven thing, he takes chances with this writing with every book. The legendary writer Joyce Carol Oates, who, by the way, is in our audience, she wrote in the New York Review of Books that each of Richard's novels is completely different, with many called masterpieces. He's also an effective and outspoken environmental activist, and his latest on that front is currently rocking Australia. It's a book called Toxic on the Tasmanian salmon industry. So what underlies it all is a deep love for the natural world and compassion for all its creatures, which include all of us. So for such a versatile and fearless writer, we couldn't ask for a more perfect conversation partner than Jane Hirschfield, a celebrated poet, essayist, and translator who is known for her insightful, precise, gorgeous poems that go deftly into a topic, image, or experience and excavate its meaning almost like a turn of a hummingbird. It's just, just this opening and we're in another place. It's just magic. And she writes of the natural world, of impermanence, beauty, injustice, grief. Her most recent book and her 9th poetry book is Ledger. Sorry, it's a little bright. I put covers on my most precious books. And she says that she wrote it in grief and into my bewilderment at our human inaction and environmental devastation. She's also the author of classic collections of essays, books collecting the work of world writers, and others. She has many honors and awards, founded Poets for Science. I could go on, but I want to get us to the conversation today. And I'd like to start by turning to the very first words of the first poem in Ledger, words that have now become kind of well-known. The first poem begins like this. It's called Let Us Not Say, and it says, "Let them not say we did not see it, we saw." Welcome, Jane and Richard, writers who help us see.
Thank you so very much, Sherilyn. And I am, as you were just told, Jane Hirshfield, your host for the evening. I could not be more glad to welcome all of you who are here to hear from Richard Flanagan, a great novel of Tasmania and Australia and great novelist of the world. And I too would like to start with a place acknowledgement. I am speaking to you from the hem of Mount Tamalpais, north of San Francisco, whose elders are the Miwok people, the coastal redwoods, and the salmon, who are all of us together hugely challenged at this moment by a year of extreme drought, where every morning we wake to another beautiful day and wonder what that is going to bring in the fall when the fire season arrives. The second acknowledgement I would like to make is the most obvious irony, which is the book which we are celebrating tonight was written in part pointing out the way that human beings of a certain kind on this earth, of certain cultures and certain lifestyles, have so often surrendered our lives to the screen. This is made very literal in the book itself, where the fingers tapping on the screen begin to vanish into it. Our mammalian nipples, our knees vanish as if photoshopped, the book describes. And this vanishing of our own human embodiment echoes also the vanishing of the species and beings all around us. And yet a point made many times over the course of the book is that this goes forward unremarked upon and unnoticed. And so I didn't want to be silent about the fact that the irony that here we are doing this event over Zoom, over a screen. And I don't know if we should apologize for taking an hour of your fully embodied lives and asking you to look at these few square inches of rather frequently commercialized space, or whether we should celebrate the way that Zoom allows literature to do what literature has always done, which is cross borders of time and language and culture absolutely lightly, taking no toll on the planet from jet fuel emissions. And so I thought I'd begin by simply asking you, Richard, how do you feel about launching a book through these electronic means?
Well, we had a very lengthy technical introduction, didn't we, Jane? Which left us both feeling like we're about to step out of the landing module on Mars. It was so wonderfully detailed. I feel that it's not technology that's the question. The question is how we've allowed technology to be captured by the most powerful corporations in human history, and how they are in this process of enclosing our hearts, our souls, our deepest feelings, and making of them simply profit. And I think in all that there is a great lessening of who and what we are. And when I wrote the book, I was reading a lot of the poet John Clare, the 19th century peasant poet, who I find very beautiful. And I think oddly his work speaks ever more to these times now. He was born in the south of the Fen country in England, which was the last part of England to be enclosed. Enclosure was that great historic movement that went on for 300 or 400 years, whereby the common lands, which were held under a sort of really what we might now recognise as an indigenous system of land tenure, where every aspect of these lands were commonly held and understood to have material value and also spiritual value, personal value, social value. And Clare's poetry is all about the wonder, the beauty, the joy, and the way in which an individual's identity is completely rooted in this larger sense of these commons. There's a poem which wasn't really known until the 70s that Clare wrote, that I quote from in the beginning, where he talks about how enclosure like a Bonaparte, let not a thing remain. then there's a couple of lines down where he says, and they hung the moles like traitors, you know. And I thought how, as they took away all our common lands then, just simply for the richest and most powerful, we're now, and there was that vast external enclosure. Now we're living through a period of a vast internal enclosure. And now these great forces are seeking to make wealth and possess the things that are most fundamental and internal to us as human beings. And so, you know, I don't have a problem with speaking on Zoom or things like that. They're good things. But I think that there's another aspect about which so many people have commented that's dangerous and disturbing, and in which we risk losing something that's fundamental to us as human beings. And I think these crises we're living through at the moment, the ecological crisis, the social crises, the health crises, they are all part of the same thing, and connected to it is this enclosure of the soul that's going on that the book seeks to speak about.
Yeah, so, you know, I couldn't help but think, Wendell Berry, our great poet and novelist and essayist, got into a lot of trouble some years ago for confessing in a major magazine that he handwrites all his books. He doesn't own a computer. He doesn't know how to touch a computer, but his wife types them. And people got very upset about that. And, you know, at the other end of the spectrum, Richard Powers, whose book, The Overstory, is one that I'm sure you also have read in this vein of mourning and correction that we are also engaged in at this moment. I don't know if he still does, but I know that some years ago he was dictating his books using dragon speak onto his computer. And so, you know, there is this large range. And I love your drawing the distinction between the enclosure of our attention and the tools of our attention, because we are, after all, a tool-making species. So I wanted next to look at the theme of that this particular event takes its title from, the way your work, your novel, defends the beloved and the radiant world. And one of the passages that I feel is a piton for this book is an early glimpse of historical connection to the waking living world, which is humanly occupied, but also beyond humanly occupied. The passage in which the father goes out every morning to kneel down before the day's opening light. The father is dead long before this book begins, but this memory is very important. And since I like for people to be able to hear some of the book itself at these events, I wonder if you could read us that passage, which begins with the daughter Anna sitting in hospital by the bedside of her very ill, dying mother, which will become a theme we'll come back to. But could you read that passage, please?
Certainly, Joe. Where did Francie go in her dreams? Anna wondered as she watched over her that night. Was she returning to her childhood stories of a fabulous past of rebel priests, magic, a world where the convicts cursed and fate answered, where sea eagles stole babies and brought them up in nests in Bass Strait Islands, where priests froze adulterers to the spot by staring at them? Brought up in poverty on a Depression-era scrabbling 50-acre farm, Francie viewed her childhood on that northwestern Tasmanian hill as rich beyond compare. The father, whom she loved deeply, would each morning walk down the 3 back steps of their little weatherboard farmhouse with its newspaper-lined walls and fall to his knees. And there in the Melrose Hills, halfway between the immensity of Bass Straits Ocean 20 miles to the north and the massif of Mount Roland an equivalent distance to the south, that tiny prostrated form, let his soul fill with the glittering azure of the sea, the ultramarine of the mountain, and the bands between of ploughed volcanic earth and vibrant forest and crops rippling in the racing cloud shadow. The red, the green, the blue. If he were to make a flag, that would be his tricolour, and he would call it home, family, love. If he were to shout it to the heavens, he would cry, us, we, ours. But he knelt. And kneeling there, head bowed, with the immense universe vibrating in and out and through him, that universe which he understood as him also, Francie's father would each morning thank God for such beauty that there is in this world.
Ah, absolutely gorgeous. You know, the faceted evocation, the sentence by sentence creation, raising in us of what is a summoning to wholeness, and the sense of place, the sense of inclusion, the understanding that all of it is us, we, ours, and the making of that a flag. I just think this, you know, this runs throughout the themes of the book as an exemplary moment. And because when we talk about our books, I always feel like when I give a poetry reading and I say the things between the poems are supposed to live with no commentary. You know, they're supposed to stand on their own. So what's a reading for when poets get up and say other things? And I always tell people, oh, it's so you can get the gossip. So I'm going to ask you a gossip question, which is, you know, I grew up in New York City in Lower East Side of Manhattan, a world of concrete and red brick. And yet my own earliest memory is of the first time I was taken to the country when I was 2 years old, lying in the grass, dark, high hedge behind my head, and the taste of blackberries in my mouth. And I think this is my first memory because I recognized what was missing from my world before that. I recognized that this was the home that my mouth had been waiting for, and my ears, and my back tickled by grass. And I'm just curious, do you have a similar, a formative memory, like Francie's memory of her father's daily bowing to the day, or like my, you know, single scrap of salvation in my urban childhood? Do you have such a formative childhood memory?
You know, when I first went to America and started doing book tours, and I suddenly felt as if I'd come out of another age, and it was a very distant age. The island I grew up on was very backward, very depressed. I was born not a mile away from where my great-great-grandfather was sent as a convict slave servant on a farm in a little village. And when I was 2.5, we moved from that village to a very remote mining town in the middle of a vast temperate rainforest. And they'd only managed to get a road, a very crude road, that was just a muddy track into this mining town the year before. And that was ancient Gondwana land, remnant rainforest, unlike anything on earth. And I grew up there. I was there till I was about 10. I grew up with this overwhelming sense that everything that was extraordinary were the things that weren't man-made. Mm. And it wasn't until I was a young man and started travelling that I realised that's not the experience of most people in the world. For most people in the world, the most extraordinary things they grow up with, the measure of all things is man-made. the measure of my world were all the things that weren't man-made. And there was also this sense of the enormous dynamic power of that natural world. So that there were, in this rainforest, there had been little mining towns that had lasted 10 or 20 years and then been abandoned. And you would go to these, and the rainforest had just consumed everything. You know, you might see a railway dog, 60 feet up in the air that a tree had grown through and thrust up, and there it was flying through the air covered in vines. And that was an everyday thing. When I began writing, I mean, the whole tradition of the modernist novel really encompasses the idea of the urban world as freedom, as liberation. And indeed, it really was. People in your country and people in Europe particularly, where the country was feudalism, slavery, the city was freedom. And there are differences in North America, but there's still that romance of the city as the space of liberation. And there's profound historic truths that underlie that. The world I grew up in was the bastard issue of a convict slave system and the near successful extermination of the indigenous people of this island who'd been here for 40,000 years. And for both these people, and there was a mashup of those cultures, the convicts and the remnants of this attempted genocide. Most Tasmanians, the issue of those people today. For the indigenous people, the country was freedom. The natural world was freedom. And a lot of the commentators during the convict slave period, in which Van Diemen's Land was a totalitarian, a very early proto-totalitarian society, noticed that the moment convicts escaped or got free, they all fled to the bush and adopted a semi-indigenous lifestyle. So my experience was of this overwhelming natural world. The culture was one where the natural world was the place where you found freedom. It was where you would be liberated. And the city was the state, and the city was oppression. When I began to write, I, of course, like everyone, I was an imitator, and I tried to write stories of crowds and cities, and they were dreadful, because I never saw a crowd till I was about 24, and I was in London. I was terrified, I had no idea, that what really frightened me was that all these people around me, and I did not have a connection to any one of them. That there wasn't one I could find and I would be able to trace their family, friends, and have a connection. And that overwhelming sense of solitude, which you find every great city is in the end a great solitude. It brought up in me an absolute terror. And at that time, I was reading a lot of the European greats, and I loved all that work. But I recognised in its genius, it proposed a central idea of such overwhelming power that no one ever commented on the strangeness of it. And that idea is that you're alone. Kafka's K dies like a dog alone. Chekhov, you die like you live alone. You can repeat this endlessly when you go through, or all those writers. And it's not that that's untrue to human experience, but it was untrue to my experience here, where I grew up. It's very clannish here. I've got 50 first cousins that I know of, and that's just the beginning of it, You are never alone here, and you always live and exist through others. That's the only place you have meaning. And so it took me a long time in my writing to find ways of expressing this, because I didn't really find models for it, and I had to, you know, as Bello says, make my own mark my own way, and it took me a time to learn how to do that, because those wonderful lines of yours that Sherilyn quoted about let them not say we did not see, we saw. But what that begs is, how do we describe what we see? And that's always the most difficult thing for any writer, to find that stillness where you can actually recognize the you know, the very chairness of a chair, the very essence of something, not what you've been told it is, you know, to see something, to smell something, to know something for what it is always the most difficult thing for a writer, and that's their greatest challenge. And it's a challenge that never really ends for them, because you develop a style, a technique, and at the beginning it allows you to say something in a fresh and new way that's honest and truthful to what you see. But if you keep on using those techniques, that voice, that style, what once was true slowly becomes stale and then cloying, and finally it becomes a cliche and a lie and untrue. And so that's why when I write, I try and make myself write a different book each time, so that I'll be forced to think again each sentence what it is I'm trying to describe that I see just in front of me, and that it's not an easy thing. And I have to, again, look anew and try and rip those cataracts away from me so that I can describe what I see. So I realise I've gone on far too long there, but I hope that answers some of it.
Oh, that was magnificent. And there are so many directions that I could go from there. I mean, I think I'm going to ask you, what do you think makes the distinction between an incredibly powerful sense of place and history and relations and clan that you describe as being part of your background, that can go two directions? And very often in the contemporary world, it goes to the direction of tribalism and exclusion and hatred of the other and fear. And yet in your life and in your art, it has clearly gone the other direction, towards looking at the colors of the sky and saying, this is all of our flag. And I'm just curious, you know, do you have any sense of what makes a person go one direction or another? Because I think that is one of the central issues of our time. If we are going to survive as a species, we need both to recognize the absolute specificity of this plant I know is edible, this plant I know is toxic, this action is beneficial to all beings, this action creates not the remarkably useful solitude that I find anyhow is the premises on which art making can take place, but the solitude of people cut off from one another in their individual cubicles of narrowed rather than broadened attention. How do you explain yourself?
Well, I don't explain myself, and I just render what is inexplicable as prose, I guess, Jane, and leave it for others to decipher. I'd say I'd say, oh God, it was such a large question. I'd say firstly that I wasn't seeking to extol the experience I grew up with as better or superior. I just merely wanted to describe for those who are listening how it was different, and how the challenge for me as a writer was to describe that difference. There's no form of life that isn't capable of wonder, that doesn't deserve honour, and there's no form of life that isn't capable of evil and doesn't deserve to be judged accordingly. So it's certainly not proposing anything as better or worse. But the larger aspect of your question, I think, goes to the way I think for every one of us, our lives are really a strange journey between our need to conform, which is very strong within us. I mean, as a species, we're social, and we've learned if we want shelter, if we want food, if we want security, if we want culture, if we want all these things, then we have to agree to many things we don't find agreeable, and our nature is inclines us to agree. You know, if you sit down four of us with quite different opinions, we'll tend to try and find something that we can agree upon rather than violently disagree. That's what we do as human beings. But at the same time, within us all too, is this desire for the soul to be free, to honour whatever the truth each of us carries is. And every human life is really this journey through the war that results between this need to conform and this desire to be true to, you know, the what we carry within our souls. And what results, it's a war that never ends. And really all our life is a record of the rubble that results. And there is no final answer to it, because we have to find a way of honouring both things and hopefully living a life that that we you know, we don't despair of. But there is no final answer to how to live that life, and all of us search for us, and none of us find it. And I think the role of literature is not to tell people how to live, but to describe how it is that we do live, and to ask questions that arise from that strange chaos that life is.
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that perhaps what helps is for a person to find the experience of connection more powerful than the fear of permeability. That our fear of the other, of being taken over, is, as you yourself said, you know, it is an evolutionary force deep in us. But I think of that young boy roaming the woods and seeing that, you know, our human-made structures can be intertwined with the natural world, and the natural world is not terrifying because it takes a building back. So you know, love and terror, the great cathartic aim of art, proposed all the way back by Aristotle. I wanted to talk a little about fires, because this is something that your book was fire forged, and it is an experience that we here in California certainly share with Tasmania and with Australia's summer of burning. And, you know, we had a day here this past September 9th, which was like the photographs I've seen of Malakuta and some of the descriptions that pass in your book. The day never grew any lighter. You woke at 7 and the sky was completely red. Not a red sun, but everything was red. At 8, at 9, at 10, at noon. If anything, it grew deeper red and darker. Headlights were on all day. Street lamps stayed on, house lights stayed lit. And one difference for us here in that day was that the fires were not about to come take us. These were distant fires. It was very high smoke. The smell of the smoke was less sharp and profound than it was on other days that did not have this stunningly undoing lack of ordinary light. The cat came and cowered next to me all day. Even for the animals, it was undoing. And this, for me, it was as if a scrim had been torn back for a day, and you could see the damage that we, with all of our decisions, have caused on the earth. Clearly, a glimpse of what we had actually made with climate change. And I've thought, in regard to your book, but I've thought of it, for a long time now. There's a brief haiku by the 18th century Japanese poet Issa. In this world, we walk on the roof of hell, gathering blossoms.
Yeah.
And that has taken on, ever larger and more multidimensional meanings for me over the years. And where I sit with it now is, yes, it is a hell realm. Yes, there are blossoms. Neither undermines the existence of the other. Both are true. And this, I think, is one of the most central things that I felt in reading your book. The obligation to see the hell realms, the obligation not to turn away from blossoming. And so I wanted to ask you, since tenderness can be found in any circumstance, and kindness is almost required of us to survive the most dire of circumstances, I wanted to ask you, in writing this book, did you find that the story itself just brought you to putting these realizations into the book, these recognitions? Flowers just bloom, but in the face of hell, to keep walking around, sometimes it takes a little courage. And I was wondering, did it take enormous courage for you to write this book? Or for that matter, the Narrow Roads book, which also takes us through another kind of hell realm. Both of your books in many moments I both could not stop reading, and it was unbearable because the pain which is given us so clearly, let them not say we did not see it, we saw. Your books see, and they see the flower. So is this hard for you? Did you sometimes frighten yourself?
Well, I think I'm always a bit frightened. I think to write is, you do write in terror smiling, don't you? I think. For me, this may sound strangely odd and paradoxical, but when these fires came here, as they've come, I know, to the west coast of your country, and suddenly everyone understands that this is nemesis for our hubris. People who've never thought about these things at the deepest level suddenly realize what has happened and why it's happening. And yet, what it also leads me to think is that in spite of everything, it remains such a beautiful world. And if we can just see the world for what it is and what it offers, I don't think we would give up on it. I think there's so much that blinds us to that beauty. And novels are one form, and poetry and art, that helps restore a necessary sense of wonder and humility. And whatever the solutions going forward, they need that sense of humility and wonder I think the genius of Issa's haiku is that it recognises that if you are to look at darkness honestly, if you are to describe darkness honestly, you have to recognise that human beings ultimately are creatures of hope. Hope is the dynamic that allows us to live. And you put people in the most extreme situations and they absurdly find something to hope for. That is what we do. And so if you make art about darkness and don't allow for the possibility of gazing at flowers, you deny the most fundamental aspect of what it is to be human. And the art is actually a lie. So Issa's haiku is beautiful, but we love it because we understand it's completely true to what we are as human beings. And I think there is in it also a lesson for anybody seeking to make art about such things. And I notice in your wonderful book, I sense similar ideas, similar struggles that for me, writing this book, it was about finding a language that spoke both to the grief and despair people felt, but also allowed for the possibility of hope.
Yeah.
Because both are true to what people are experiencing at this moment. So that was certainly omnipresent in my mind as I wrote the book. And I also wanted the book to have at its heart, although I didn't know how, a kindness and a tenderness of which you spoke. I don't agree with this idea that is fashionable at the moment, that all art is political. Politics is political. It's an aspect of us. It's an important aspect of us. But, you know, politics is transactional. Politics is the enemy of love. And ultimately, what saves us from politics are things like kindness and tenderness and love. And they are larger and they speak to larger aspects of us as people. And I think I deeply understand and feel the political imperatives of the age, but you're foolish as a writer to see that as you know, the driving force for your work, because in the end you might as well just tweet. You know, literature does something larger, more important. When you write, I think we are I mean, it's an unremarkable observation that many have made, but really what makes us distinctive as a species is we conceive of our world through stories. You know, that from, you know, when we had to get out of the cave and, you know, persuade the others to come and sort of run at the mammoth or something with a few sticks or something, you know, we had to invent a story to persuade others, or we had to believe the story that the idiot was telling us that we should run after him and the mammoth or whatever, or her and the mammoth. And to me, in the novel is, you know, one of the supreme expressions of storytelling of this aspect of us. And so when you write a novel, it's not just an entertainment, although it should be entertaining. That's part of it. It's a very important part of its job. But you actually are joined into a profound intellectual, aesthetic and spiritual tradition that asks questions of us that other forms don't, that psychology can't, that philosophy can't, that science can't, that speaks to things about us that we have no other form to do. And that's why, you know, the endless predictions that the novel is dead are are illusions, because it will die when we have no use for it. But we also have no replacement for it. And for as long as that's the case, I think it will continue to be important to us.
Yeah. So, I've often felt that the great luck of anyone who practices a creative art, and that is probably most human beings in one way or another, is that it restores your sense of agency. You are not passive before the world. If you are crafting a story or growing a garden or raising a child, and that this sense of agency and the sense of possibility and change are essential to maintaining some antidote to despair, no matter what you're in the face of. And again, I found this throughout your book. One of the largest aspects of it is what do we do at end of life in the face of death? And what is presented, the characters are specific human beings with particular histories which are governing how they are and who they are. But in this book, in which, as I read, I felt that every single character is at its center. When the book is looking at any person, it's sort of like a planetary system where the gravitational pull is mutual. Francie is the center. Terzo is the center. Our wonderful stuttering failed artist, who is the caregiver and the embodiment of feeling and accurate seeing of what creates suffering and what releases suffering. He is at the center. But the reason that Anna is the book's protagonist is because Anna is the one we see change. And so this capacity to alter, to be confused, to be bewildered, to be barraged by suffering and not know what to do with it, and then to make your way through to a different understanding over the course of the book. This is why I think we feel Anna to be the protagonist. And, maybe she gets the highest word count. But for me, I really weighed, is Francie, who has so few words, but every one of them counts, and her dilemma, is she like the body in Faulkner being carried from county to county in the back of the wagon that is the magnet at the heart of it? But this malleability and possibility sense are the restorative capacity. And I think finding that sense of agency is for each of us essential. And what reading a novel does, it's a kind of instruction in that. Most novels are the story of some kind of change. And the character who's the most fixed is the character who, well, I can't do a spoiler, so never mind. One character is fixed and it doesn't go very well for him. But I have so many other things I would love to talk with you about. I would love to talk about these issues of end of life. I would love to talk with you about the argument between the hubris of will and the humility of vulnerability to things as they are. I would love to talk with you about uncertainty. There is a beautiful passage in the book about uncertainty. Maybe I'll just read that, and you can respond to that, and then we'll hand it over to the audience questions. So again, this isn't what most people who are talking about the book seem to pull out, but it struck me because I care so much about, what Keats called negative capability, that if we're not willing to abide in unknowing and mystery and uncertainty, we narrow our world rather than expand it. So the quote from the book, it was as if everyone had to believe their own story. This is so apt for certainly America and the arguments amongst Americans going on right now. It was as if everyone had to believe their own story. And story, really, because if they stopped believing there would only be reality left to deal with. No one doubted or was unsure. Every individual was infallible because it was their truth. And so there could be no truth, and the world was wrong. And perhaps it was no surprise that no one could any longer decide what was sickness and what was health, what was living and what was dying, far less know what was good and evil, for they were confident only in the knowledge that if they said it, then what they said was right. And, maybe you've already spoken to this. I loved that you talked about humility because it's a word I've found more and more on my tongue in recent years.
I found that very interesting and moving, and I'm not quite sure how to respond. And there was so much. I was just interested, and I was listening, and I guess we are always allowing ourselves to be captured by other people's myths rather than acknowledging what the world is. And I think we're in a strange moment when we're terrified of dying because so many of us have never lived. And I think the terror of death that consumes our society is really reflecting something else, and that is a sense that we've failed to ever live, and that's the horror that grips so many of us. And I think COVID has led a lot of people to reflect much more deeply on this, about what is a good life and what is a good death and what is living and what is dying. People seem to be finally concerned about these things and looking at how they live now in a way that wasn't a very present current in society before that. Your point about Anna being a changing character, I think I'm always disappointed in novels where a character at the end is the same as they were at the beginning. They've just experienced some adventures and experiences, and it's like a kitchen table where you put the chairs on one side and then the other side, and then you stack them up and vacuum underneath or something. Then you put the chairs back, and that's the novel. And I was reading a Tolstoy short story one day, and he does this thing. And I realised it's so true to life. And his characters always have that intensity of conviction that they're heading down the highway, at 150 miles an hour, and they're going to do this, and there is no alternative, but they have to do this now, and it's got to be done immediately. And then mid-paragraph, something happens, like they see a mushroom in a field or a thistle, or they're playing cards and somebody coughs over there, and in that moment, the whole story or novel will pivot, and the character then suddenly decides, I'm not that person, I'm this person, and he's heading down the highway in the opposite direction at an equivalent speed, with a completely contrary set of thoughts, beliefs, passions, utterly changed. And he's utterly changed because of a moment of complete insignificance and meaninglessness, but it has meaning to him. And I think this is actually true to what we are. We believe we are coherent beings, that are Jane or Richard, and we amble along a certain path, but really we're full of sound and fury, and it's constantly changing within us, and we have very strong opinions about things until the next moment we have strong opinions that are diametrically opposed. And I think novels are something that allow us to recognise this strange aspect of us as human beings. I've got to apologise to everyone who's watching for the way, when we started this, it was a very overcast day here, and now the sun is beating in. I'm just going to lower a blind, which is unfortunately green, so I'm going to take on a very anemic shade. But
all right, good. That happened to me. I had a Zoom earlier today, and the exact same thing happened. The sun started pouring through a skylight, and suddenly everything was very odd. So we could keep going for another 2 hours, and people who are listening, we're not going to stop promptly at 8. And if you need to go, of course you will. But I do feel like I am obliged to allow those who brought their questions to the Bay Area Book Festival to have their voice. And so I will now turn it over to the questions, which I think Sherilyn is going to offer up.
Hello. Yes. I was going to comment, like, you're both on other sides of the world. And of course, Richard, the sun was coming in and Jane is losing light compared to where we were when we started. So this is like the world in rotation here, in our Zoom room together. Just to say to everyone watching, if you have questions, do go ahead and put them in the Q&A at the bottom. As is often the case when it's an amazing conversation, people don't do that because you're just completely like Richard listening to Jane. It's like, I'm not thinking of other questions or my response. I'm just listening. But if you do have questions, we are going to go, I don't know, another 10 minutes or whatever. So do feel free to put them in there. Some people did submit questions when they got their tickets, and they kind of fell into a couple of categories. So I'll just summarize. One question I'll sort of pose first that is a combination of a few. Cheryl asked, can you speak to what you believe to be the most essential aspect of writing a novel? And then how does that differ in your experience of writing nonfiction? That comes from Sally. And yeah, just questions about that to Richard. Just what is to you the core of writing fiction?
Well, I'd say two things. One is very prosaic, and that is that it is, as de Maupassant said, simply a case of putting black on white. And it is about sitting at a table and simply getting it down. The other aspect is more mysterious, and that is that it is. I think it's a journey inward into your soul. And if you would ask I guess the question is, what's the difference between non-fiction, journalism, and fiction? And I think when you write journalism or non-fiction, it's a journey outwards. You go out, and what you see and what you touch is what you report on as accurately and as truthfully as you can. And when you gloss it, it should be clear to the reader what is your gloss and what it is that you've seen. That the distinction should be clear. To write fiction, for me, is a journey in the opposite direction. It's a journey inwards into your soul. And most days, your ambitions wrecked on the reefs that encrust the soul. But very occasionally you make it in there, and what you discover is that you're not one person or one history, but that you're contained within you, as each of us contain within us, the possibility of being a million different people. Someone far better than me, someone far worse, the murderer, the tyrant, the kind person, the good person. Every possibility of what it is to be human exists in each of us. And I think we all know this in moments of great grief or great passion or ecstasy. But most of us have to tamp it down, or we'd be considered mad and we wouldn't be able to get on with our daily life and work. But the daily life and work certainly of a novelist, is to go back to that place day after day and explore what it is they share with others, and what it is that what that commonality is, and that possibility of what it is to be human. So that would be my answer to that question.
Great, thank you. One just came in from William Stockton. He's asking, when, Richard, did you get introduced to John Clare's poetry? And William says that he grew up in nature himself, and his poems touched me, he says, very deeply when he was pointed to them a few years ago.
I came across Clare in the 90s. I just found, I was in a secondhand bookshop and I came across, I can't remember, a 1940s or 1950s edition of his memoir, which is a strange document. And it's about his escape from the asylum, when he walked from the asylum back to his hometown in the south of the Fens. And the language in it really struck me. In fact, it quite inspired me when I was writing Gould's Book of Fish, and it had a big influence on that. And from there, I went to his poetry, and I returned to it frequently. It's very, for those who haven't read it, I commend it to them. He was a man of almost no education. He was, in the parlance of the day, a peasant poet. He's strongly linked to the Romantics, but he has a much more pedestrian, indigenous sort of pedestrian. I mean, it's just not that high blown language of the Romantics. It's a beautiful language of the everyday, and it's beautifully observed and beautifully detailed, and full of an immense love of the world around it.
Great, thank you. I just lost my sheet. Okay, sorry. Another set of questions, I said they sort of fell into a couple categories, is about the environmental crisis, and sort of quote what to do. Your novel talks about, of course, seeing and facing. Vijaya is a person who asked a question. She actually, I know her, she teaches at University of San Francisco in environmental studies and religious studies. And she asks, how can we best make the, quote, commons a more visible shared experience for most of the world that would activate a sense of active we-ness rather than the I-ness we are all encouraged to live in? And she says, thank you for your work in putting, quote, enclosures into your novel.
I don't have an answer for that question, but I think it may be the question of the age, really. We need to lose the poisonous I-ness, as your questioner put it, and return to some better sense of awareness, of understanding that we're not alone. But if we don't face up to these problems, we will be utterly alone. So I think it is the question, however we phrase it, that we should all be asking and seeking the answer for.
Yeah, I think just so much about the Living Sea of Waking Dreams is about seeing and connecting with each other versus literally vanishing, from our own bodies and from our connections, Anna and her son. So I think the novel really, really does explore.
Cheryl and I, the last couple of years, I've been spending a lot of time in remote Indigenous communities in Australia, way out in the desert up in northeast Arnhem Land. And one of the extraordinary things I became aware of was the immense respect and visibility of elder women in these communities, and the way they didn't just have a place; they had this very esteemed place. People ran round after them and looked after them and saw them, and then I would come back out of these settlements and communities, and I'd return to my world, and I'd see how we don't see so many of us, and we particularly don't see older women, and there's so little respect for anything much, and it really struck me, and it was there that I got this idea of a woman, a middle-aged woman, who's slowly becoming more and more invisible and losing parts of herself, and who's invested a whole life into this highly individual pursuit of success, believing an idea that this is what most realizes her as a woman, as a success, and so on. So that's where that came from.
It's great. Thank you. Just maybe one last question and then turn it back to you, Jane. So anonymous, a woman probably has asked, do you have a favorite book, one you've cherished so much that you've read it repeatedly?
Look, I've got so many books I love, but the book that astonishes me each time I return to it, I go back to it every 5 to 7 years, and it always strikes me as completely different, and I see all these things that I hadn't seen before, and I can't understand why I didn't see them before. And that book is Karenina. I think it was Faulkner. They asked him what were his 3 favourite novels, and he said Karenina, Karenina, and Karenina. I mean, it really is an extraordinary book, and what not the least extraordinary thing about it is how Tolstoy wanted to write, really, from what I understand, a very mean-spirited novel about how a wicked woman was punished, and you know, the artist within Tolstoy was infinitely greater than the small man, and the novel completely escaped him, and it became this most extraordinary book, and in which Anna is the most beautifully realised character, and I think it goes to show that the least interesting thing about a novel is the author's intentions and the author's observations about the book. You know, that they really tell you nothing other than about the smallness of the writer. I think it was your noted literato, Elvis, who said, when I sing, I feel I'm touched by God. Now, you don't have to have a belief in the divine to understand that Elvis was probably a pretty ordinary fellow who had this most beautiful voice. And there was something extraordinary about that voice. And I think there's, you know, the least interesting thing about Elvis is Elvis. What's extraordinary about Elvis is his music. And so it is with writers. That's why I think I always find writers' biographies infinitely boring, because they're the least of the person. You know, what is what's extraordinary about a writer you love is their writing, not the person. I mean, meeting writers, I'm sure you've met far more than I have. I mean, it's always, as you know, an added disappointment. Hello?
I don't think so, not today.
That was a joke.
I was muted, so I didn't laugh right away.
Was that right? I thought, oh my God,
it's like silence after the joke lands.
Yeah. sometimes there are cross-cultural misunderstandings. I mean, it's always good to be misunderstood as a writer. I've never known why writers want to be understood. But I remember when I was starting out, I ended up in Portland, and they had trouble with my accent, and they introduced me as a French poet. It was the early 2000s. It wasn't a good time to be a poet. It was a very bad time to be French in America. And that such are the difficulties of cross-cultural exchange.
Funny. So Jane, do you want to take over? I could keep going. But yeah.
Well, I imagine it's time for people. We've gone an hour and 15 minutes, and I could sit here all night, but we don't want people to feel badly if they have to leave. I love what you said about Anna Karenina. When I read Anna Karenina as a teenager, I thought it was a book about adultery. And when I read it as an adult, I thought, oh my goodness, this is a book about everybody's relationship to their spiritual lives. And, even the most minor passing characters, we are always told something about their relationship to their spiritual lives. And I began to feel that, the book is as much about Levin as it is about Anna. And at the end of it, I have treasured the description of him. So he's just had an enormous awakening experience of the divine flooding his life. And then he's walking along with family and friends in the community and he suddenly notices that something can still irritate him and that he can be bothered by trivial things. And I just find that the perfect way to describe what it is actually like in this human body, mind, life, spirit. That, I just had this great experience of God, and I have an itch. Oh, that was annoying. This is what great novels do. But meanwhile, everything is grounded in the sense of connection to the large. And the adultery thing rather fell away from me. So I'm going to send us off with, I think, a bit of an allusion to Rilke, because there's poetry references throughout your work. There's a marvelous allusion to Larkin's poem "This Be the Verse" in near the start of this book, and it takes its title from John Clare's poem "I Am," which I said in the chat. Everybody should go find that poem and read it after you've read the book, because the themes in the poem are so interwoven with the themes in this book. But in this sense of wonder, a word that you haven't used, I've noticed that you haven't used it, is the word awe. And I think awe is really interesting because awe is the combination of the recognition of beauty and the sense of terror before it. And it feels to me a very appropriate relationship with the large, is that so to get to the Rilke, I was thinking of the opening of the Duino Elegies, where he says, "Every angel is terrifying." And many of the developments in this book have to do with what is our relationship to terror and what is our relationship to beauty and what happens when they're both true. And one of the turning points late in the book is when the character Lisa Shawn says maybe human beings can't bear the beautiful, and so they feel they must destroy it or allow it to be destroyed. But I wanted to end with a quote that I think will be dear to you already, Richard, because you have said things along these lines in various interviews, and leave us with this question of questions rather than answers, of the fertile ground, which is the relationship of asking rather than the relationship of dictation. And so Rilke said, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves as you'd love a locked room or a book written in a foreign tongue. Don't look for answers which can't be given you because you wouldn't be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. So I thank you, Richard, for your enormous eloquence, your enormous invitation to us to be willing to live everything, for these profoundly fascinating and felt answers you have been giving to my poor questions all evening. And I just cannot thank you enough for your books and for your presence in the world as a writer, as an activist, as a human being. So I have something I'm supposed to say to close us out, which is to tell you again that I'm Jane Hirshfield, and that you've been watching the Bay Area Book Festival Unbound. And now, as we unfortunately close this part of the evening, Sherilyn is going to tell us some events that are still to be looked forward to in the future. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you very much. It's been lovely.
Richard, any last words or no?
Well, I'll just say, I just want to thank Jane. Rilke said the purpose of an artist's life is to be defeated by ever greater things. I feel that Jane stole the show tonight, and I can't thank her enough. She was wonderful.
Well, you both are totally wonderful. And I'm just so, I think everyone, I've been watching the chat also, and people have just been really moved by this conversation. So thanks to both of you. And if you have not yet, speaking to you audience, bought your copy of The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, or Jane's latest poetry collection, Ledger, you will, in a few minutes, see the slide coming up on your screen that is a link to our partner bookstore. You can also, of course, go to your local independent bookstore, and we'll also put a link in the chat. But I think most of you who have got tickets for this event have already got a copy of the book, which is super smart. But now that you've heard this conversation, I know you're going to want to buy other copies. I am. I've already bought like several for other people.